Today I'm going to walk you through, in sometimes excruciating detail, a theory first detailed by research teams in 2024, arguing that the Djoser pyramid complex contains a hydraulic lifting machine that could move the massive building stones. A central mystery to the construction of the Egyptian pyramids has been how the incredibly heavy granite and limestone blocks used to build them were lifted from one course of stones to the next. Traditional archaeologists would say that gangs of men used wooden rollers covered in water, milk, and whatever other lubricant to haul them up dirt ramps. On the other end of the believability spectrum are people that believe the ancient Egyptians had sonic lifting devices or the ability to levitate rocks. Both of these perspectives make assumptions about the skill of ancient peoples. Many Egyptologists would argue that more can be done by brute force and sheer strength and willpower than modern humans would ever assume. While I agree that disregard for human life and suffering applied by a totalitarian regime can achieve results in direct proportion to the number of human lives extinguished, I don't think we give the ancient Egyptian engineers enough credit for thinking smarter and not harder. However, I also don't agree that everything that can't be instantaneously explained has to be the result of ancient peoples having things like aliens to teach them, nuclear power, a hydrogen reactor, or other such wildly advanced technologies without industrial precedent. With these beliefs, I am solidly in the middle of the issue and believe I can bring some practical engineering knowledge and insight to the conversation. I am not a scholar, I have no PhD in archaeology or Egyptology, but I did grow up in the 90s on a large farm, working with my hands. I have moved heavy items, fabricated with wood and metal, and spent my entire life building and designing things that require precision, use gears, ropes, pulleys, leverage, the basic building blocks of mechanical force. I was also reading Graham Hancock's Fingerprints of the Gods from my local library in 1998, way before it was cool on the podcast circuit. With that out of the way, I hope in the coming months and years to bring technical and hopefully well thought out videos that clearly walk through ancient megalithic projects and discuss the evidence for a specific engineering solution to seemingly unsolvable problems in ancient history. I know that you and I will both have unanswered questions, and on my next trips to Egypt, I will have a lot of specific features of these pyramid sites to track down to try to answer those questions. Now, let's get into the incredible engineering of the Djoser Pyramid's complex hydraulic system. Egypt's incredibly long civilization is due in no small part to its relationship with the Nile River and its predictable yearly flooding. The flooding resulted in a farming technique known as basin irrigation, which ultimately turned Egypt into a food surplus society with the ability to export grain. This yearly flooding also led to another phenomenon related to our topic, that of controlling water, floodwaters, and the Nile by means of canals and other systems. Now, of the approximate 188 pyramids in Egypt, 117 of them are located on the left or western bank of the Nile. Here's why. In ancient Egyptian beliefs, the West was associated with death and the afterlife because the sun sets in the west. So pharaohs and elites were buried on the west bank of the river where the sun died each day. The east bank was reserved for the living, temples, cities, and daily life where the sun was reborn when it rose every day. The reason for putting the pyramids on the west bank of the Nile also shows the depth of knowledge ancient Egyptians had when it came to the geographical placement and forward thinking of their sites. Here we see a map of the Nile River floodplain as it is today. As you can see, all the major pyramid complexes are located close to the Nile River's fertile land, irrigated from flooding, but on a higher elevation. Since the Nile flooded in a predictable manner from the south to the north, the Egyptians were able to understand precisely where the normal floodplain was located and how deep the water was. All of these factors combined to show the picture that not only was the Nile the source of life in Egypt, they understood its flows, managed its overflows, understood canals, and their useful potentials. To bring this all back to the hypothesis I'm attempting to find evidence for, if the Nile was used for bringing stones to pyramid construction sites, like even mainstream archaeology argues, then the river, its tributaries, or a canal must have been sufficiently close enough to carry the heavy blocks to the site. And if the water was brought even closer to the site via a canal or dried up tributary, could we still find evidence of them? Incredibly, yes, we can. A paper was published last summer that shows evidence of check dams, water runoff channels, and hydraulic lifting systems at the Djoser Pyramid Complex at Saqqara. The main thing I want everyone to wrap their mind around is that during this time, water was far more abundant in Egypt, and flash floods had to be controlled. The Saqqara complex needs to be viewed through this lens. In the desert east of the Djoser complex at Saqqara, there is an absolutely massive rectangular object in the desert named Geyser al-Mudir. While many theories ranging from an animal enclosure to a fortification have been proposed, there is no consensus. The large square in its walls sits firmly in the path that flash floods would have taken when they rushed through the Abusir Wadi toward the Djoser complex. As you can see from the terrain lines on this map, the water would have hit the walls and then been directed into a floodplain, and the proposed reason for all this relates to our overall topic and is fascinating. If the walls were meant to be a fortification or other such normal structure, you would expect the walls to be the same height all the way around. However, on this structure, the western wall, farther from the Djoser complex, is higher than the one on the east. This effectively acts as a two-tiered check dam with a holding pond in between. Of particular interest is a large, deep, and mysterious trench just south of the Djoser pyramid, directly in line with where water could have been diverted to from the Abusir floodplain. In fact, many things that seem strange to have been built at these pyramid locations make far more sense when you just start adding water to the site. Dry channels fill up, tunnels to nowhere become pipes, and suddenly you see the rise and fall of the Nile bringing life to Egypt reflected in these funeral sites in a beautiful way. The yearly floods would turn the graves of these kings into microcosms of their world after construction was completed, and bring a source of power and a method to transport rocks as well in the canals. The deep trench at the south end of the Djoser pyramid makes much more sense when viewed from a side angle. Here we see where the water would have flowed into the complex from left to right, starting at compartment 0. Everything has such an industrial layout to it, we just have to try and see it full of water, a task not hard to imagine since we know that Egypt had far more rain and therefore more flooding 4,500 years ago. Here is a view inside compartment 1, first looking east on the left, and then west back toward the blocked off and unexcavated compartment 0. Much of this trench is unexcavated because of a large mastaba built over top in a later period. Everything about this image and the trench screams an industrial process with careful prior planning. If you or I started wandering through the various channels and pipes inside of a modern dam used to regulate water flow, it would be equally as mysterious until we realize we are standing in a location where humans were not supposed to be. It's an industrial location, and trying to make sense of it from the viewpoint of some chamber or temple is like trying to sit inside of an abandoned water tower and wondering where the priest kept all those candles. A big mistake I think researchers make is to try and make a culture's religion the scapegoat, covering whatever they cannot explain textually or from solid archaeological evidence. While ancient Egypt certainly was a place with complex religion integrated into government and everyday life, that does not preclude a rational Egyptian engineer from designing something purely from a mechanical or industrial standpoint. Every time I read some interesting detail in a mainstream archaeology publication and see that they put in some blanket and then they did this oddly specific stone cut because it pleased their gods, I just don't buy it. We must give ancient people the exact same latitude of rationality we would give to Leonardo da Vinci. He was also an engineer in a radically religious time and country, and yet historians do not try and shade everything he designed that we don't fully understand in terms of religion made him do it. I know this is not a one-to-one example and a bit off track from my current topic, but we have to address it. If an Egyptian complex has obvious mechanical features that are evidence of sophisticated thinking that, let's be honest, you don't know and I don't know, and Egyptologists don't know the full meaning of, we cannot blanket just say, oh, they put this massive complex stone pipe on the east of the pyramid because east is, yeah, the sun rises there. And that symbolizes life. Yeah, they wanted the tunnel to symbolize new life. That's it. Don't ask any more questions. Unless there are writings explicitly saying this, we should not just swallow a fully religious conclusion for what could also be interpreted as an industrial feature. For my part, I will fully accept that a site can have an overarching religious or funerary meaning to it, but that does not preclude individual features of the site being purely those needed to construct the site from an engineering or construction standpoint. Now back to the incredible system of water control at the Djoser site. Underneath the pyramid of the Djoser platform and the pyramid itself is a large pipe or stone tunnel running from the deep trench over to the complex, along with numerous other mysterious shafts, strange granite beams, boxes, pipes, and vaults. The hydraulic underground of ancient Egypt is one of the least talked about and yet most interesting things I've ever come upon when researching this period of history. All these chambers and shafts around the supposed funeral chamber are explained variously as waste removal shafts from construction, a labyrinth, chambers for his belongings, and the north shaft itself was where the pharaoh was supposedly buried. We are going to get into the many issues with that theory in a later video, but now let's keep following the path water would have taken through the pyramid complex. In this picture, we see the plumbing, so to speak, of the construction phase of the pyramid. Maybe everything we see here was eventually repurposed after the pyramid was built and then had a religious or funerary purpose. Both can be true. But if we are moving as the water must have, we will find ourselves at figure 1, the south shaft. To be clear, I will admit there is no known pipe connecting compartment 2 with the south shaft. However, remember compartment 2 hasn't been fully explored. But since the deep trench was eventually blocked off and filled up, probably to keep the pyramid from flooding after construction was finished, then it's not much of a logical leap to say that the south shaft once had a connection that water could be fed into from compartment 2. If this was the case, let's see what would happen to water when it got to the south shaft. Note the depth of the north and south shafts as well as the pipe connecting them. They are all located at 28 meters below the ground, putting them all in the same plane, underground. At the bottom of the south shaft is a large granite box with a plug in the top that looks exactly like a drain plug. If, during construction, the area we see now is filled with water, then the granite box we see below would be a controllable drain used to flood the known 200-meter long pipe connecting this shaft with the north shaft. The one detail I can't find for the south shaft is the way in which this drain would have worked. If the pipe connected to the north shaft was located underneath and attached to the granite box, then the filling point from compartment 2 needs to be somewhere on the main shaft. Then, when the plug is pulled, the water goes into the box. But if the shaft was filled from the bottom, from the granite box, and the pipe was connected there to compartment 2, then pulling this plug would flood the south shaft, which would then fill the pipe to the north shaft. I cannot find pictures inside the granite box or literature which would detail which way it is. But to follow the theory, this large plug you see would be pulled, and when it was pulled, water would either go down the drain to the north shaft box or water would well up into the shaft from the plug. From an engineering standpoint, I believe it makes more sense that the two granite boxes in the north and south shafts are connected via the pipe, and pulling the south plug would apply water pressure to the north plug. I will note that the 200-meter pipe seems to connect to one of the auxiliary chambers, which then connects to the north shaft. So now we have water pressure in the north shaft's granite box, which is nearly the twin of the south box, but with a bit more unique construction. The north box has significantly different construction from the south box. The inside ceiling of the box is covered in waterproof mortar, while the sides and bottom are not. This would have acted as a pressure release mechanism, probably finely tuned to keep water at about the top of the box. Then when the plug at the top was pulled, the north shaft would fill at a reasonable rate. If the entire box is waterproof, the water would come out of the plug much faster and either flood the shaft before work is ready for the level to rise, or just be unmanageable to work with. I would guess that the process of sealing and unsealing the north granite box was done by trial and error until the correct amount of pressure was obtained. The granite plug here at the north shaft box has grooves on the side for holding ropes, and of particular importance is where it's located on the box. See how it is offset to one end? If it were centered in the middle, it would be farther away from the steps at the top of the picture, where workers would have used a pulley system to raise and lower it. Look around the plug at all those chips and cracks. Although these are explained as being the result of grave robbers, it is interesting that the plug itself was not broken up, as that would probably be easiest. If the robber's goal was to make enough space to thread a rope around the plug and hoist it out, I suppose that is also possible. However, have you ever used a machine at the gym and let that weight slam down by accident? That is what I think happened here in the dark, wet tunnels, probably poorly or dimly lit. Sometimes the workers dropped the plug back in, and it was a bit off, and it hit the sides and chipped it. To me, this seems like the most human thing in the world. Your job is to stand there, raise and lower the plug when you are told to. When the plug is dropped into the water level had been covering the opening, making visual confirmation the plug was perfectly centered not possible. I would imagine a mechanical guide of some sort was installed to make a total miss of the drain possible, but there's probably enough play in the system that the plug still hit the edge sometimes. Also, I want you to take note in this image of the vertical scrapes on the right-hand wall going all the way from top to bottom. We are going to come back to those later. So where does that leave us? We have shown the path water would have been able to take in a very controlled manner, all the way from the check dam to the north shaft, and now we are able to raise and lower the water level in the south shaft. Why would being able to control a massive column of water during the construction of a pyramid be important? Because stacking massive granite and limestone blocks hundreds of feet high turns out to be a really sucky job with more than a few smashed fingers and toes. It was possible to drag the blocks overland from the Nile when they arrived by boat, unless a canal was dug close to the site and the blocks floated over on large rafts. But human muscles do have their limit no matter how hard you push them. So Egyptian engineers, having lived in a world of yearly floods, knew that a rising water level could lift a floating platform, much like it would lift a boat. The north shaft during construction could act as a massive piston with pushing or pulling power to raise a column of water from below ground level 28 meters to ground level. Since two tanks of water connected at the bottom and relying on gravity alone, no external pump, will equalize pressure and water level between them, we know that unless the Egyptians had built a water tower as tall as they wished to lift a block with floating, a modular system of lifting needed to be used by digging down. Any height the block needed to be raised above ground level could be done by adding sections of flotation, although I have two other possible theories that may make sense as well. This diagram shows a side cutaway look at how the entire process would work from start to finish. However, there are a few variables I would like to discuss, and a few unknowns that I hope to figure out in a trip to Egypt in the future. At its core, what we see here is a very basic hydraulic system minus the pump. In this photo, the researchers proposed two methods of moving rock with the flotation piston. The first here is using a lifting float with the assumption that a side tunnel here, slightly below ground, was used to drag blocks of stone onto flat ground over to the float, which had an extension on it that would lift the blocks higher and higher as the pyramid itself rose. This would work sort of in the way an oil rig drills. The drill goes down 20 feet or so, you add another section of drill bit, keep pushing that original drill bit deeper and deeper in the earth. Same thing here. You keep adding sections of extension until you get it high enough that the block can reach the top. This is called volcano construction, where the blocks of stone come up through the center of the pyramid. However, we must remember that the float itself couldn't be raised more than the height from the bottom of the shaft to ground level, where the water in the north shaft would equalize with the south shaft. In this picture, we see multiple phases proposed by the researchers. Phase 1, the load, is called lift loading. We see the float resting at water level and the drain plug in place. In B, we see the first water filling. The drain plug has been raised and the water level in the chamber rises up, pushing the flotation device and its extension platform on the top. In C, we see the first water draining. Before the water is drained, supports are pushed in the wall, keeping the platform from lowering. In D, we see that as the water level goes down, it unfolds a hypothetical second section from the extension platform. The drain plug is replaced. In E, we see the water is filled a second time, and the extension rises even higher than it would have before. The float cannot go any higher than line ZM, but with the extension unfolded, greater lifting range is achieved. This theory, in my opinion, has the added issue of the stone blocks being used having to be small enough to fit in the side tunnel and then be maneuvered onto a floating platform in the north shaft. I think it also makes sense that this water piston's power could have been used on the pull stroke. Let me explain. It would make much more logical sense to have the float carrying lots of small, easily manageable stone blocks that, when combined, are heavier than the heaviest block that need to be pulled up to the pyramid for construction. These weights, bound together with wood and ropes, would be the counterweight attached to a system of ropes and pulleys coming out at the top of the shaft to a block and tackle system that could magnify the pull the weight stack exerted when the water level dropped. This theorized system would also have the added benefit of water conservation, if, via careful manipulation of adding and subtracting weights and timing of granite plugs, the north shaft could run the water backwards into the south shaft, or more probably into some other shaft where it would be a holding pool. In both theories, it would be possible to drain the north shaft from a bottom side drain to a lower holding pool. Either way, I believe the builders would have used some method of water conservation to refill the deep trench with the drained water expelled after one cycle of raising and lowering the float. Water conservation would have to be considered in such a desert environment. It could have been done via a canal with an army of shadoofs refilling the deep trench, much like water was moved from irrigation basin to irrigation basin. I do not know which answer is correct, but I believe this is worth investigating further. Whatever method was used to harness the rise and fall of water levels in the north shaft for mechanical advantage, I believe, at the very least, there is hard evidence for a floating platform having moved up and down in the north shaft for an extended period of time. Look at the right-hand wall of the north shaft. There are clear marks of something having scraped up and down it multiple times in a particular path. Then look above the granite plug at the wall. There are more scrape marks here fitting the size of the plug where it dragged against the wall as it was being raised and lowered. Then we have the four small rectangular holes in the wall, exactly opposite each other. They are larger than the typical putt holes for supporting a floor, but are entirely consistent with being holes for locking beams attached to the floating platform. The setup here would let the platform be locked into place at two different heights, keeping it from either sinking or rising, which it was, I cannot say. The north shaft is full of so many passages, stairways, and other side rooms, all of which could be a clever part of the original hydraulic puzzle. None of this has anything to do with, or precludes the possibility of the shaft being later used as a place of religion or ceremony or burial. All over the world are examples of people taking one type of building and turning it into another. I've seen airplanes turned into houses, churches into Airbnbs, and old schools into hotels. I see no reason why both a hydraulic system for building, religious overtones, and later burial could not all be simultaneously true at different phases of the project. However, the idea that the stone box in the north shaft was the original burial location of Pharaoh Djoser puts this resting place in stark contrast with every single other burial of every other pharaoh. The few small bones that had been found inside the granite box are not argued to be part of any original burial. However, those are all topics and issues to discuss in future videos. So what does all this mean? Do I believe it? Do I have a take on it? Well, let me just put it like this. Everyone seems to want to put their absolute stamp on something and say, this is how it is. I'm trying to follow the basic scientific method. We have a hypothesis, we attempt to find evidence for it, and we attempt to prove it. Maybe it doesn't rise to the level of theory, but we build evidence, and each piece of evidence in a chain should be evaluated. The chain as a whole should also be evaluated because each individual piece on its own can absolutely be explained in many different ways. The chain itself should be subjected to the most scrutiny here of any of that, because that's the linkage from Geyser Al Madir check dam all the way to the deep trench, south shaft, etc., north shaft. I do have issues with the theory as a whole, and I do have questions. Maybe once those questions are answered, it'll make more sense, and I can come back and say, hey, I've made another video. I personally now can subscribe to this theory. Remember, everything I've been doing here is walking through the research paper and seeing, does it make sense? What are the evidences for that, etc. Now, my questions are, if you look at that picture, that graphic of the north shaft cutaway where it shows the different layers of dirt and soil and sealing matter. And now one of my questions is, if you look at that graphic which shows the side cutaway of the north shaft granite box, what we see is the side tunnel, the 200-meter tunnel, coming in and then being blocked by some sort of porous material, which theoretically the water would just seep through into the box, the south shaft. To me, that's an issue. It depends on when it was put in, whether or not it's an issue, but it's an issue right now in place because it seems like it's a difficult and really strange place to seal off when everything else is sealed. You could have just as easily sealed the other end of the tunnel. It seems like it's built in to have this slice of porous material for the water to soak through, almost like a really thick coffee filter. It doesn't just make sense to have that right there to me. So that's one question I have with filling the north shaft would be, how would you fill it rapidly enough to make this not just a day-long waiting game, waiting for the float to rise up? You could drain it a different way and have it sink, but that is a question I have. Another question I have is, how long would it take to do one cycle of raising and lowering, either floating up blocks or lowering them down? It seems like it would take quite a long time. And without having the water rush very rapidly in and out, I don't know how efficient it would be, but I have also not taken the time to figure out how much a float would hold, how many blocks it could pick up at once. Maybe it was actually effective. That is a question I have. The math needs to be worked out for how much lifting force the water has, how much flotation, what weight would be able to sit on top of a raft and either not sink underwater or be at the bare minimum height to raise blocks up. So we need to figure that out. There needs to be some math done on that. But remember, I have to also say there's a lot of time in this project. They had a lot more time to do these big projects, and they were going to do it right. So that's a question I have. The other question I have would be all these different shafts dug into, like those 11 shafts coming up the side that looks like French fries. Um, I have an issue with those in that I would have an issue if they were built at the time that this was a hydraulic device. If it was a hydraulic device, don't put a quote around my head saying, I think it's a hydraulic device. I'm just showing you the evidence for it. And here's my questions against it. If it was a hydraulic device, that seems to be a really leaky plumbing system. If you're trying to make a hydraulic cylinder, you want it sealed up as much as possible. I know this is not really a hydraulic cylinder. There's no pump, there's no pressure. It's just water equalizing. But that is a lot more water if it was built at the time of construction. All those shafts, it's a lot of water seeping into places where you don't really need it to go. So that means that either they were built after the shaft, probably part of the burial chamber setup, or it just wouldn't have worked very good because that's too much water going everywhere else and seeping into the ground. It's not sealed enough to just only go up the north shaft, only float there. So that could be a question. That could be an issue depending on when they were built. My other issue is we don't have an actual pipe between the deep trench and the south shaft. We don't have that connection. If it's not there, that's a big issue with this. You could say, hey, the entire system was run backward and the water came in from the Nile. Okay, but we haven't found that yet. So I'm just being as intellectually honest with you as possible about the issues with this research paper theory as I see them, for whatever that's worth. Also, since we're being intellectually honest here about this, and I'm not being dogmatic that this is a certain way, it's taken me about a month in the video editing process to get to this point. I have a sneaking suspicion, and I don't have a lot to back this up, but I have a sneaking suspicion that this could have also been repurposed or used, and it does not preclude it being a flotation system for this to be the case. But it seems to me that it could also have been designed as a large trap to keep robbers out. I'm sure we've all seen those famous images of that tomb in China where they had all the terracotta warriors. I forget the name of the royal that was buried there. All the terracotta warriors and the traps and the crossbows all ready to go. They didn't want their mummies looted after they're put in. So perhaps this was all a large, uh, perhaps this is all a large trap to keep robbers from coming in. They fill up the shaft with water, the body would be in the box, although still doesn't seem that much like any other sarcophagus I've seen. But we'll just, say if it was that way, maybe they just put the body in the box and filled the whole thing up with water. The problem with that, because there's a problem with every theory, there's no good theory that answers everything that I've seen without having questions. The problem with that is that the body would be destroyed. You're filling your body, you're filling your shaft up with water, wooden sarcophagus. It's gonna get the sarcophagus is gonna get ruined, the mummy is gonna be ruined, it's not gonna be dried out anymore. And if there's one thing I know about how ancient Egypt afterlife was, the preservation of the body was the whole reason they mummified. The mummification process was the whole reason why their afterlife would work. The body would be able to be resurrected. He's in as good a preserved state as possible. Destruction of the royal's body would be tantamount to banishing him to everlasting lack of eternal life and no resurrection. And what's all this worth, anyways? So that's an issue because I believe the body would be destroyed by flooding the chamber around it with water, unless it was all just a giant ruse and the body was snuck off some other place that was dry. But currently, they're saying if this was a tomb, the body was in the north shaft box. So I don't know where this leaves us. Where this leaves us is I need to find more answers to these questions, and I think I need to make a follow-up video to that. I also want to try to mock out a construction of the underground, build one, a small model, and see if it will actually work as good as possible to the level of technical skill I have. But that's one thing I was thinking of. So I think this is a very interesting topic. I think that we need to keep looking for evidence that engineering was used, but I think we need to be very careful about evaluating that evidence and just following it and just being honest, like, hey, this is an issue. Maybe we'll work through it. But right now, this is an issue with the theory. I think that's okay. I think that's what we need to be doing more of. Any researchers on I think all of us researchers on the more um, the newer generation that aren't archaeologists looking into stuff, I think the most important thing we all need to say is, hey, in my theory, here are the issues with it. Because isn't that what we all accuse archaeologists and Egyptologists of not doing? We absolutely do. So whoever is out there doing this kind of research, and I'm, newer to this, I want to at least set the example for myself that I will tell you, here are the issues with the theory. Even though it's not my theory, I'm still presenting it to you. And so I say, take some ownership of putting that out into the world that this is a theory and a hypothesis. I think it's good to take ownership of the flaws in this theory and just let you know that this is something I'm going to try to get answers to. And if the answers are not in my favor, I'll let you know. If they're not in the theory's favor, I'll let you know. So I really appreciate you all watching. And this has been probably the most work of any video I've put in, even though I didn't have to fly anywhere for it. But my plan is to start getting these questions down on paper and then making a trip out there and just trying to answer as many of them as possible. So I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly learned a lot about flotation, mechanics. I was doing some cosine math on the pulley. So I definitely enjoyed making it. And I hope you enjoyed watching it. Thank you.